Welcome to Classical Chats. I'm Tiffany, and today we have a guest from the UK, Zachary Davis. He is a composer, he's a student, and also he runs a podcast. I actually got to know him virtually because he invited me to be on his podcast, and so now it's his turn to be on mine. I'm excited to learn about his story, because I spent that entire episode on his podcast talking about myself, but I didn't really know so much about him, except that he loves Dave Brubeck's music. And so we're going to talk about how Chopin's Nocturnes actually inspired Dave Brubeck's music, and also Zach's journey composing and all of the jazz and classical music influences on his own compositions. And you're also about to hear some of his own compositions in the background of this episode. So I hope you enjoy. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome to Classical Chats.
Thank you for having me.
I laugh because I'm not as experienced as you are with podcasting.
Well, I don't know about that, but anyway.
Well, for those who don't know, I just was a guest on yours. Can you actually say the name of your podcast? How do I pronounce
The
it?
Euterpean Podcast. Euterpean, and there's a full
podcast.
story behind that I'm happy to go into, because half
of
my friends are like, is that the European podcast? You know, what is it?
No, when I first saw the invite, I was like, what is that word?
Yeah, I'm
Anyway.
not even sure it's a real word, but I'm sure we can go into that if you want to at some point.
Yes, I would love to know about that. But first off, for those who don't know you, and also because this is the question that I ask every single guest, who are you? Well, not who are you, but how did your journey with classical music start?
Well, how did it start? Well, I'm currently a music student at King's College London, and I'm an aspiring pianist and composer. But how it started, I think I was 5 when I first started having piano lessons. And it was through school. My family and I had just moved up from Wales, which is where I was born. And what did we do? Well, I had my grandma's piano. She gave it to us. And through my school, as I said, I had some piano lessons. And it didn't stick extremely well. I mean, I was by no means, like any of these children you see on YouTube at all. I suppose the most significant thing, thinking about this, because I knew this question would come up, is that when I was 5, I was kind of curious about the piano and composing. And of course, when you have these beginner pieces, they're all in C major, which means they only use the white notes. And not that I thought those pieces were racist or anything, but I was thinking to myself, I want to use some black notes as well. So not that I understood necessarily what scales were or the patterns they're in, but I composed this sort of like 30-second piece for the piano, and I performed it proudly as a 5-year-old, and it's since lost, probably for the best. And I didn't really compose anything for several years after that until I was 12 or 13, which is when I moved house. And I moved next door to this jazz musician, this semi-retired jazz musician called Brian Thompson, who's a clarinetist and saxophonist. And several serendipitous things just happened at the same time that I look back and I think, it's stranger than fiction. I moved next door to a jazz musician who's happy to give me lessons in all kinds of things. And then I discovered this classical pianist called James Rhodes, who, if you don't know, is very, within the classical world, I suppose you'd call him controversial. I mean, he's not controversial in any other way, but he goes to his concerts in jeans and a t-shirt and is very honest about what he thinks about certain pieces and what they mean to him. And I thought, that's amazing. I love that. And what happened then? So I was 12 or 13, and I think British viewers will know the ABRSM exams. And I think I had just done my grade 3 exam. So I'd had a really slow rate of progress up until that point for 7 years or something. And then within that sort of period afterwards, through the stimulus that through the jazz musician and my new love of classical music, I then did my grade 8 exam something like 18 months later, and went from performing there's a melody in the right hand with a chord or two in the left hand to like a Beethoven sonata and a Bach prelude and fugue, and I've been obsessed ever since. So,
Oh.
and yeah, I mean, I'm sure we can talk about all kinds of things, but that's the brief version, and I hope I haven't gone too much into too much detail there.
No, I love getting to know people, including yourself. So now I understand the Brubeck and the obsession with jazz influence musicians. Now it makes
Yes,
sense. It's because of your
it's
neighbors.
it's one of those strange things that jazz and classical music didn't converge until much more recently, within the past couple of years. They were sort of separate experiences within my musical life. Classical music is
Really?
what I would
Ah.
play and what I love to listen
Mm.
to, but I've really struggled with jazz. And as Oscar Peterson
How come?
says in his book on studies and etudes and minuets on jazz, he says jazz piano is a different technique, and I completely understand that, because the whole idea of improvisation and scales and modes and things like that, to spontaneously use them and create something that sounds nice and that is expressive, is completely different to learning a piece and trying to interpret it. And I
Mm.
suppose jazz in that case, as a result, was a much more passive experience. It was something I would always listen to, particularly New Orleans jazz, which I feel retains it's almost trapped in time. New Orleans jazz, in that it's like a historical music in itself. If you listen, it's all
Mm.
acoustic instruments, and they play in a very similar way as they did in the 20s with Jelly Roll Morton, for example. So yeah, just tell me to
So
stop if I'm
then,
going on too much.
no, I would never stop. I'm just such a novice in jazz because I'm exactly like you in a way that I experience jazz in a passive way. I just listen to it. I don't play it. I also know I don't have the flexibility in my brain to play anything improvisatory because my left hand is absolutely useless. And I attribute that to my poor understanding of harmonies, probably on the spot. Like I understand them when I look at a classical piece of music, but um, it was just something that I cannot really be part of. It's just something I enjoy listening to, jazz. So I'm curious how you combine the two now. Because do you see both influencing your compositions, and we can segue into your Brubeck obsession at any point
Absolutely,
that you'd like.
absolutely. Well, this is a very complicated question, because it's at least complicated for me. There is an interview actually with Dave Brubeck, and I suppose this is a good segue. And he's with Marion McPartland, and they did this kind of radio show where she was a jazz pianist, classically trained jazz pianist, and she would have guests on, and they would play together and talk about the music. And it's great. Some of them are on Spotify. I totally recommend you and your listeners check them out. Anyway, she did one with Dave Brubeck, and she asked him about this classical side of him, because he wrote masses and oratorios and ballets and things like that, which not that many people know about. And she said, well, some people think that between never shall they meet, and he said, never shall they depart. In other words, the line between the two isn't necessarily a line. Even he kind of just saw them as a musical act and a musical experience. And I'm not saying that I necessarily think the same thing, but I struggle to define where my jazz influence ends and my classical influence starts. I think compositionally, I'm trying to fuse them together in a particular way, but it's something I'm still struggling with, and I hope that answers that question.
I know it's a very difficult question, maybe not that interesting to ask someone. It's not like how much salt do you put in your food and how much sugar do you put in your food. It's kind of, I guess, much more of an organic process, right?
Well, yes, and when you write music, it's one of those things that's ever changing and ever growing. And one of the pieces I sent you, I wrote in, I think it was actually the end of 2019. So I would have been 18. And of course, I recognize myself in my compositional voice. in that. But I don't write music exactly like that anymore. And it's an interesting process. And I think everyone is the same. Everyone who writes music, you kind of look at the music of your history, of your past, and you think, no, that it's nice, but I don't want to edit it. I leave it where it is in the past. It's like a past self.
Which piece is this?
So,
you sent me two.
So this is the Millarden piece. This is a piece that was a song, actually, inspired by hyperinflation. Who would have thought, the most artistically inspiring topic? But it was for a music society, the Modern Music Society at my university, and I was given a prompt, which was a billion Reichsmarks note, and the number is so large because of hyperinflation. And so I learned a bit about that culture, and I tried to recreate something that was reflective of that history at that time.
That's interesting. And then now, I guess the second piece that you sent over is a bit more an updated representation of your current style of composition.
Yes, so that was an experiment, I suppose, in bitonality that I kind of wrote. I did write at the beginning of this year, and it was.
So for those who don't know what bitonality means, what does that mean?
Well, it basically means playing two keys at once. That's the essential definition, I would say. I suppose
How do you pick which two?
Well, this was actually something I considered a lot in the writing process, and I had recently heard a piece by Dave Brubeck, which is bitonal, or to be more exact, bimodal, which means you maybe have C major in the left hand in the bass and C minor in the right hand. So it creates, although the tonic is the same, the C, the home of both keys, they have completely different inflections. And so to combine the two, you create a slightly jarring sound world. And for me, the whole point of this was bitonality is often seen as a compositional technique that's used, yes, in its own right, but that is a sonic effect, an effect that is jarring. And I wanted to delve a little bit more deeply into it and see how expressive I could make something that was bitonal. And it's deeply inspired by the Brubeck chorale from Points on Jazz. So if you listen to it, you'll probably think it's plagiarized. So, and it probably is. But I took a similar idea of having two different keys played at once, and explored how I could create or generate a form of expression that I found convincing.
Well, I actually quite like your style of composition, because I remember I mentioned how I generally don't love the direction that modern compositions go, where it's just a style of complete chaos and disjointedness, and maybe it's just that competitions like to choose pieces that are the most ridiculous and virtuosic as possible, which means banging your hands there and then banging your hands 5 feet away and doing all crazy stuff. And I kind of miss that tonality or sense of order and beauty. Also, I think somehow it's much nicer to, for lack of better words, to hear kind of continued story.
Yes.
But
Leonard Bernstein, for example, at the end of his Norton lectures at Harvard, predicted a return to tonality in contemporary music. And of course, he was a composer, but similar to Brubeck, his compositions aren't played as much as maybe Aaron Copland or something like that. Of course, Dave Brubeck's jazz is still played a lot, but his classical compositions maybe not so much.
Let's talk about, seriously, just focus on your obsession, Dave Brubeck. Do you remember your first encounter with his music, and do you know what it is that stands out to you so much that you are such a big enthusiast?
Well, I suspected you would ask this as well, so I've been thinking over the past several days about what it is about his music. And ever since I asked you why Schumann, I came to realize how difficult a question that is. So I suppose at the beginning, I had this book of jazz transcriptions of many different artists, and two of the pieces in this collection were by Dave Brubeck, or the Dave Brubeck Quartet, and that was Blue Rondo à la Turque, and what else? Take Five. And Take Five, of course, was actually written, the melody at least, by Paul Desmond, the saxophonist of the quartet. But jazz is a very collaborative art form, so they kind of all had a hand in creating it. And that kind of got me thinking, because at that point, this was probably when I was first discovering jazz as well, at 13, 14. Take Five is in 5/4. The à la Turque is in 9/8, but in a strange aksak rhythm where you have 3 groups of 2 and a group of 3. So it's this very strange play with rhythm that I think I was drawn to first, and this is a defining feature, that and polytonality of or bitonality or whatever of Dave Brubeck's music that I was intrigued by. But it was only until, I would say, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic that I decided to purchase. I have a collection of books here because I knew this would come up. The Brubeck Nocturnes. Any beginners out there, or even intermediate pianists, I would totally recommend these Nocturnes. They are not too challenging, but they really give an insight into his compositional process. And I fell in love with them, only then to discover they were played by John Salmon, and then more on that later, because I ended up meeting him and he came on the podcast and everything like that. So, and he's a lovely man. But what is it about his music? I'm not sure. I can't really say why, other than that feeling. It's like when someone asks you to define jazz, and of course you can say, well, it's this amalgamation of African American music and classical music that came together, but it doesn't really describe it. It doesn't describe the tapping of your foot when you hear jazz, and when you hear something that isn't quite jazz, you don't tap your foot. It's something that is just beyond words. But there is one thing I'd like to point out that I discovered only the other day, that is, in 1951, and I should preface this actually by saying that I just have come out the other end, the recovering end of a back and wrist issue. And as a pianist, this is, I have to take a month and a half off, and I'm doing all these stretches and so forth.
You injure from playing?
I think so. I don't know. It could be stress mixed with playing, mixed with some tension. Maybe a bad habit of how I was using my thumb. I've become an expert on the anatomy of the hand and arm now, for some reason. This is slightly sad and dorky.
But it's helpful knowledge, I'm sure, for pianists.
Absolutely.
I don't know so much about that.
I have another book here to absolutely recommend, which is called The Complete Pianist, which I'm sure I'll talk about later. But anyway, in 1951, because I'm sort of all over the place, 1951, Dave Brubeck broke his neck surfing.
Ooh.
And he had back pain as a result for up to 20 years. And when I was having back pain, of course, I didn't break anything. It wasn't as severe as that. The only music I could listen to without feeling miserable was Dave Brubeck. Now, I'm not a superstitious person. I don't necessarily think that, I could sense his back pain. But his way of playing had to be adapted to the nerve damage he suffered. And whether I detected that and correlated it somehow subconsciously, it wouldn't surprise me. It seems a bit too coincidental, but it's great music.
I mean, I understand also with Schumann, the dual personalities. I kind of can relate to that very much as someone who is present on the internet and also not present on the internet, and everything else that I do that I don't show on the internet. So there's definitely something that I feel connected with Schumann's music. And so not necessarily that I can sense Florestan and Eusebius But yeah, I kind of understand what you mean. And what other recommendations do you have prepared? I don't even know where to segue next, because it seems like you have a plan here
Well,
with your.
yes, it's like I'm trying to
Well,
indoctrinate your audience into my
I love.
cult.
I mean, no, but I what I love about this is that I get to talk to so many different kinds of people, and they have such diverse knowledge. And so, what do you have next for me?
Well, next on your cult list of Dave Brubeck, I have the books that I play, because I play Dave Brubeck most days, sometimes to warm up. And not that I'm putting Dave Brubeck down or his music down to say, oh, I use it as a warm up, but actually it gets me in a creative zone that allows me to think creatively about improvisation or phrasing, because it's a little more flexible than most classical music. And here I have a mixed collection. So, of course, they're the Nocturnes, which I would totally recommend. And
Do you think they're similar to Chopin or John Fields or?
it's a hard question. That he is absolutely inspired by Chopin and Bach. I think within the classical world, those two composers are his key influences. Of course, he had other influences within jazz, but classical music, yes, Chopin and Bach are throughout them, and you can hear it in the voice leading and the way that the quality of the compositional craft is so high that you have these lines going everywhere. And of course, not that is intrinsically good. Music can be good without that. But you play it and you think, yes, I can understand what he's doing. This is unexpected. And I'm amazed by it.
Do you have a favorite one?
Sorry?
Do you have a favorite one?
Favorite nocturne?
Yes.
A Misty Morning, I would probably say, is my favorite at the moment. It includes some nuances of bitonality. It has a great melody. It's kind of like Debussy, but later on, of course, so maybe mixed with Bartok. But ultimately, you come out the other end and you think, no, that's Brubeck. He has his own compositional voice, which I think is great. And there are other pieces by him as well. And I should probably distinguish clearly that he did have a more classical side, which few people know about, and a more jazz-oriented side, which is what he's mostly known for. And it was only through listening to the Nocturnes that I discovered his other more classical music. So there is one ballet that he wrote called Points on Jazz. And this is for two pianos. He often wrote for two pianos. And it's a piece that is based on a theme he wrote in 1958 on his tour Behind the Iron Curtain. And he was in Poland. And he wanted to think of a way to thank the Polish people for their great contribution to music, namely Chopin. And so on his train ride, I can't imagine having a more creative train ride than that, he wrote this theme to a piece called Thank You, and I'm not going to try and pronounce thank you in Polish, but that's the title. That's it. There we go. I'm not going to. I can't say it for some reason.
Last I said this for it was 8 years ago.
I can't get it in my head.
Probably wrong.
And it's a great melody, and perhaps I can play it to you after the podcast. I probably can't for copyright reasons on here, but it was only years later that I think it was John Salmon who said to him, you know that this melody is almost a direct quote from Chopin's B-flat minor Mazurka. He said, what? And of course, his mother was a classical pianist and piano teacher, and he heard an awful lot of Chopin and Bach growing up. And so perhaps somewhere in the back of his mind was this melody. And listeners, I encourage you to look up Points on Jazz. Anthony and Joseph Paratore play it brilliantly. And then compare it with the B-flat minor Mazurka. It's in the same key, and it's got the same opening phrase, or a very similar opening phrase, the same contour.
That's interesting. I only listened to a snippet, so I didn't pay too much attention to the similarity of that and Chopin. That's very interesting.
Well, there are loads of I could talk endlessly about it. So you just make sure you cut me off if you want to get a point in.
Well, I mean, I'm now curious what it was like for you to meet, I guess, one of your idols, right? John Salmon.
Yes. Well, I discovered John Salmon through the Nocturnes, as I had said, and the Nocturnes were actually recommended to me by a former school teacher, music teacher, and to help me with composition. And I had started this podcast, and the podcast was one of those crazy things that I just did in lockdown, and was like, "Oh, I'm going to be insane and start a podcast." There are crazier things to do, I suppose. And I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna email John Salmon," and he is the nicest man in the universe. Honestly, it's crazy. And he said, "Sure, I'll come on your podcast." He was totally relaxed about it. He then went even further and was like, "I've written this, and it'd be good if you read this." And I have these audio recordings of a conversation between me and Dave that have never been released publicly before, and you're welcome to use them in your podcast. So there I am.
Wow.
At like age 19 with these archival objects of study and things that are unheard. And I was like, that was a lot of responsibility. I was like, I have to make sure that
What an honor.
I was so shocked that he had trusted me that much. And I thought, okay, well, I have to really commit to this. I have to do it well. And I made quite an extensive plan for that podcast. I think it's, even to date, the longest podcast episode. And we talk about everything. Honestly, I'm probably extremely excited at the moment to talk about Brubeck, and maybe I'm not getting across as much information as I would like. And I would totally recommend that episode with John Salmon. It's called The Piano Works, I think.
Was he your first guest?
He was my fourth guest, I think. Fourth. It was in December. And the podcast is a whole thing that has come as a complete surprise. The kind of amazing opportunities that have arisen as a result. But yeah.
Yes. So when did you have that urge to make a podcast and really develop it on your own?
Well, I'd always been interested in thinking about music as well as playing it and writing it. And I'm sure you've seen, because I know you're also an obsessed person about Glenn Gould. I don't know if obsessed is the right word, but I know last week when we were talking,
I do admire him
Glenn
very
Gould.
much.
Anyway, Glenn Gould, and I was watching these interviews and these conversations between Glenn Gould and Humphrey Burton and Leonard Bernstein, perhaps, maybe not together. But I was like, that kind of conversation just doesn't necessarily exist in the main media anymore. And not that I could replace those giants, intellectual musical giants, but I thought I might as well try and contribute something towards this vision I have of a world which accepts classical music not as something elitist in the negative sense, but just another art form that is approachable. You don't need to dumb down the language that you're using as long as you explain what you're saying.
Exactly. Yes.
And people like it. People can take it. They absolutely can take it. And they like it, as I found out. So that was where I came up with the idea. Then came the naming process. And I was like, well, shall I go for the Zachary Davis podcast? I thought, no, I can't possibly do that. Shall I go for Classical Chats? I was like, no, someone's already got that.
Yours came before mine, didn't it?
I don't know.
When did you start yours?
Mine started in late September, I think. So maybe it did come afterwards.
I started mine
but
early September.
But I was trying to think of different names, and I had recently read these two books by Stephen Fry on Greek mythology, and I had discovered that we get the word music from the Muses, but the ancient Greeks actually had, and this is where this sounds awfully pretentious, and I'll get to that. The ancient Greeks had a muse for music, and I think for poetry, called Euterpe. And I thought, well, no one knows this word. We've got to bring it back, right?
now that rings a strong bell of something that I don't remember, just because I read not all, but I read some Greek classics during my studies at Columbia, because everyone had to do that in college, and that somehow rings a bell of something. I don't know why, but keep going. So Greek influence on the name of your podcast.
Yes, so I was thinking, well, I'm doing a podcast about classical music. Some people are going to judge me for it anyway. I may as well just go all.
Why?
Well, there is a certain negative, and I make a distinction here between, a negative kind of elitism, and I'm not saying that a positive elitism, the word is so stained that you can't really use it in a positive way, but Richard Dawkins often talks about the quality that often comes with expertise, and I think we have to differentiate between expertise and excellence and elitism, which is more similar to snobbery. Anyway, people think that classical music is replete with snobbery and elitism, and I thought, oh God, people, might they think I'm strange? So I decided that I was going to go all out with the name. I felt that if I went with the most pretentious name possible, it would cancel out all of that elitism. Because people, as I've said to you before, I mean, I've had friends say, is it the Euterpean Podcast? And I'm like, no, it's not the Euterpean Podcast, it's Euterpean. I don't even know if it's a real word. I think it's been used historically, but I can't find it in any dictionary. So I guess you could say that I'm a pioneer in that respect. I'm joking, of course. But that's where the podcast name came about. And I had a friend on, Jess, and we spoke about literature and music and the artistic links between. And then I had a few more friends on. One was a PhD student at King's, where I am, and she's studying composition, I think, with George Benjamin. And it just went from there. And I got in touch with Samuel Andreev, who's a composer and a YouTuber. And he said, sure, absolutely. He came on and we had a good chat. And the rest is history, as they say, in that very cliche
you've
way.
had some prominent guests. I think you had someone from Weimar Hall.
Yes, I had the artistic and executive director of Weimar Hall. So that was a shock. I'm always shocked. I was surprised pleasantly, of course, when he responded, when you responded, when anyone responds, really.
But I am nothing compared to someone as I don't want to use the word elite, but that's kind of a big deal.
It's a prestigious venue. It's a very historical and prestigious and respected venue. And there again came a kind of responsibility of lots of people might listen to this. I better make sure I'm prepared. And so, well, I have a good respect for my listeners. And I know, as I said before, I think absolutely they can take all of this musical jargon. I think they can take, even if they're not musicians, is what I mean to say.
Yes.
Non-musician listeners can take this kind of conversation, and and I find it great fun. I think it's great fun.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you're trying to do something that really preserves its integrity and not really dumbing it down, because I see that so often nowadays, and on social media there's so many sensational content, and it's precisely dumbing things down just to get certain reactions. And I think that's why I agreed to come onto your podcast, and I was very intrigued by your endeavor. So how do you see your podcast and also your composition studies going forward? Which year are you in?
So I'm in my second of 3 years studying undergraduate music. And yes, who knows? I think someone once told me you can't plan a career in music, and if you try, it just turn out completely differently. And of course, there's in the age of the internet, you can plan a little bit because there's such interconnectivity. But ultimately, my plan remains broad and slightly bold and, forward going.
Yeah, in what sense?
So I hope to finish off this podcast season in May. We'll see about future guests. And then in September, sort of going along with the academic calendar in the UK, I hope to do 2 episodes a month and to really accelerate the amount of conversation I have for the second season. Compositionally, I hope one day I can integrate it somehow. I was thinking actually of changing the music that I use for the introduction to my podcasts. That is an excerpt from a piece I wrote in 2018, I think, or 19,
It's nice.
for clarinet and piano. And I was like, well, what else can I do? Maybe I'll play an extract of Mozart. And then to end it as sort of like a closing title, I will change, the Mozart Sonata in F major in 3/4. I don't know the K number. There are probably 1,000 Mozart sonatas in F major, aren't there? But anyway, so I was thinking,
332?
well, there's probably more than one because he wrote a lot of sonatas. I'm not sure.
For piano?
Yeah, for piano. I think
he wrote 18 only, no?
Gosh.
Or
well,
something.
My Mozart sonata knowledge is limited. I'll just say that.
I should know this, but
So F major, it starts with the triad in the right hand in 3/4.
332. I think there's only
one in F major.
In F. There may be another one in the beginning that starts with a chord, maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. I haven't played all of the Mozart sonatas. I've read them all at some point in my life, but I don't remember.
Well, I was thinking to myself, would it be satanic to, in the right hand, put the piano part up an octave, and then the left hand down an octave, but instead of in F major, in E major, so you have this kind of bitonal Mozart. I thought maybe that would upset a few people. I played it through, it kind of sounded jazzy. And this is something I quite like about jazz, and why I'm particularly drawn to jazz, and why I hope I can indoctrinate you all into Dave Brubeck's classical music, is that I feel jazz is an idiom and a harmonic language, and all of those things is an art form that allows for extreme creative possibilities without being inaccessible. And there are many examples. I feel if Bach were born today, he would be a jazz musician rather than a classical musician. And I mean, it sounds like a slightly frivolous comment, but I was thinking about this. I think about Jacob Collier's music a lot. And of course, he's obsessed with, lines and voice leading and things like this, and modulations to keys that don't exist on a keyboard, which is kind of mind-blowing. And the kind of mentality of a jazz musician, I feel, is much more similar to the mentality of a Baroque musician than the mentality of a Baroque musician is to a classical musician today. That is to say, improvisation, harmonic knowledge, and a very tactile interaction with a keyboard that allows you to think, oh, this is the cycle of fifths, and I'm going to play this passage like this. Of course, continuo players still do that. But I am in awe, really, of jazz musicians. And just to really go all the way with my point about jazz being a very flexible idiom, is that you have amazing music, such as by Thomas Addis. And I think David Bruce makes this point, a YouTuber composer. Thomas Addis has written amazing music, but I will admit I am a musician, and my tolerance for dissonance is probably a lot greater than a non-musician. And I don't mean that in an elitist way. I just mean it like coffee. I mean, when you first have coffee, you think someone's trying to poison you. And
I hated coffee when I was younger. I would run away from Starbucks because Starbucks is everywhere in the US. I hated that smell. And then now I drink coffee every morning.
Now it's my lifeblood. I just drink it all the time. Well, not too much, in a healthy way, of course. And I listen to Jacob Collier, and he's doing things that are just as experimental, just as harmonically outrageous. And yet its ability to enthuse masses of people who aren't musicians is self-evident. And I respect that a lot. And I think that about jazz, and I think that about the works by Dave Brubeck, because you said earlier that you were kind of disillusioned with contemporary classical music because of its chaotic nature and its I don't know, it's freneticism.
It's too much of a representation of the current state of
our
society. I think everyone has very short attention spans. TikToks is what, 10 seconds, 15 seconds
Oh,
long,
I
and
haven't downloaded that app.
I
I
don't
can't
have
bring
it
myself.
either, but I understand kind of the overall attitude of just attention spans is getting shorter and shorter, and you have to be constantly amazed and with fancy camera angles and all of that. So
Yeah, and I remember you mentioned this a little bit last week. I can't remember on the podcast or off, and I was thinking about it, and I think it's to do with the shift in focus of composition. Sorry, I'm thirsty. I will have a drink of water. And jazz musicians are very harmonically focused, much like Baroque musicians and classical musicians. But when I say classical, I mean the period. And I think today we are in a highly individualized artistic state. Every composer sounds different. There are slight similarities between certain composers, but people therefore tend not to think in terms of a harmonic language that's associated with style, but think more in terms of rhetoric with their compositions. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a very literal Aristotelian rhetoric sense. You have a kind of a statement that isn't necessarily harmonically sensical, but it's a question. It's a question, and there's a lot of theatrical playing with sounds instead of through the medium of functional harmony or even jazz harmony. And I think that might be one of the reasons why, to a lot of people, this kind of confused artistic state, is a connotation of contemporary classical music.
do you have any advice as a ending points into having people who don't know either Dave Brubeck or just contemporary music in general, how they can open themselves up a bit more? Any
Well, there
tips?
are a few, and I think that firstly, I want to break that down into two questions: one about Dave Brubeck and one about contemporary classical music in general, because I think Dave Brubeck deserves his own section of the answer. And
And he should.
so I would recommend, if you want to get into Dave Brubeck, that you first start out by listening to his jazz music. I think it's essential listening. I think it's highly reflective of America at the time and jazz at the time. You can listen to versions of his pieces performed by Miles Davis, even a few of them, Bill Evans, and so on. And that will help to give you some context into his more classical works, and some of them are less easy to listen to. And I'm not saying jazz is easy to listen to either, but some of them are in a more contemporary classical style. It's his classical pieces. Then I would probably recommend that you go on to listen to his Nocturnes, as performed by John Salmon. I think they're available on pretty much all streaming platforms. And then there are a few other pieces, like Points on Jazz. That's great. There's a solo piano version, which was transcribed by Dave's brother, Howard, who was also a composer. There's the piano suite called Glances. There is Reminiscences of Cattle Country, which was written for his parents. There are numerous great pieces. And what I probably recommend you do is that you just scroll through the Spotify page, the Apple Music page, wherever you stream your music, and see what you like. And this was an interesting thing for me, because I was listening to one of his masses that I actually really like. It's a strange concept, because it's a mass with a choir. It's with the LSO. You can only buy this album though. It's called Classical Brubeck. It's with the London Symphony Orchestra and the London Singers, I think, or London Chorus or something like that. And you've got that orchestral setup and the chorus, and you've got a jazz quartet, and suddenly the whole texture will change, and you're given this improvised interlude, which is a kind of tension release. You could say it's a kind of rhetorical device as well, in the way that it functions in context with the classical medium. And I just found that fascinating, and I don't think my parents are completely convinced by it yet. That's where I was going,
Oh,
but I'm trying to persuade them that this is where future church music is at. Not that I'm religious at all, but there we go. Now, your question about contemporary classical music is actually one that I'm trying to pursue myself in my own listening, because I would say that up until a certain period in the 20th century, my knowledge becomes very thin. And I would recommend, as what I'm doing at the moment, that you go through this music chronologically. You start out at the second Viennese school, you've got Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, and that's a little tricky. But then you've got other composers, contemporaneous composers like Debussy, and then Bartok, which are a little less intense to listen to, and perhaps
yes. I can already feel my muscles tense up when you mentioned
secondary.
the second Viennese school, because I remember doing those harmonic analysis and set theory, and that
Mm.
just that was it for me. I lost my my passion for music theory class
Well,
right
yeah,
when we reached that point.
it's a strange concept, and it's different. It's difficult music. I would recommend, actually, if you want to listen to Schoenberg, his 12-tone music, Mitsuko Shida has done an amazing job of recording and performing the piano concerto. She plays Schoenberg like it's classical music,
Mm,
in a way that is expressive, in a way that is full of character, and I would totally recommend that. It's on YouTube, I think. And
mm.
then I just go through classical music history. Of course, there are many other musics, but classical music history chronologically, and end up at the modern day. And there, of course,
Hmm.
there's an infinite number of composers I could recommend, but I think chronologically is just the rule of thumb, because people, as a composer today, we look back and we think, what did they do? And we might look at music from 20 years ago and we think, okay, well, that's pretty contemporary, and now we're going to develop on that. So we're constantly pushing forward from what is
Yeah.
behind us. So it's important you go, I think, in a one specific direction. And I hope that
Ah, that's
helps. I hope that
interesting.
wasn't too convoluted.
Chronologic. No, that's very interesting. That also gave me an idea for future classical chats guest. I think it would be very interesting to have the guest curate a playlist that we
Mm.
can feature based on what you would recommend for those who don't know about either specific pieces that you're passionate about related to classical music, or just something that you really think listeners should give a listen to. And yeah, I think that would be very interesting. I completely lost my first train of
I think that's a good
thought. There were
idea,
two
though.
trains. There was the playlist, but yeah, I would be so intrigued, and I hope that those listening on to this classical chats will listen to your podcast, listen to the playlist that you are now. I'm asking on the spot to curate, and you can let me know, because I'm always fascinated by how people approach or try to introduce classical music to an audience who might not otherwise listen. If it weren't for you, for example, I would not pay attention to Dave Brubeck, I'm sorry to say. But I also think people's passions are very infectious, and in a good way. I mean, maybe not the best term to use in
Well,
COVID
no, I
times,
was
but
just thinking, it's a kind of bug. When I first started my degree, we were doing early music and Gregorian chant, and they were talking about it
oh
like,
gosh.
yeah, and I caught the bug when I fell in love with this music, and now I'm trying to basically disseminate this music as much as possible, for no
Yeah,
other
I love
reason
it.
than that I am completely in awe of it, and I think it deserves to be played more, his classical work.
Yeah, well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I believe this is the same pun that you used. Haha. I am not a fan of puns,
Me
but
neither. I don't know why I said it, but there we go.
well, see, what you say is infectious, and it has
There
infected
we
me,
go. Well,
unfortunately. Or
thank you for
fortunately.
having me.
Thank you for coming on.